I'd like to call the meeting to order.
We are good.
You are good. Okay. Reading of the minutes, 2017. Any discussion? Motion to approve them will be in order.
Move to approve.
Do you have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. At this time is the public comment period. Any of those that have signed up to speak are allowed to speak for 3 minutes. Forgot. I skipped the introductions for a second. We'll do that. Forgot to go around and do the introductions first. I am Bill Darris, Mayor of the City of Jeffersontown.
David Burton with Kipton.
Jim Udi, NDOT.
Nathan Pruitt, Planning Director for City of Jeffersonville.
Emily Liu, Louisville Metro Planning and Design.
Kevin Beatty, Town of Clarksville. Matt Minier, Jeffersontown.
Bernie Bowling, City of St. Matthews.
Jeff O'Brien, Louisville Metro.
Matt Bullock, KYTC District 5.
Thomas Wick, KYTC Central Office.
Barry Armstrong, City of Mount Washington.
Lori Pacino, City of Mount Washington.
Bob Stein, United Consulting.
Gretchen Milliken, Louisville Metro.
Mike King, Louisville Metro.
Bert Stocker, Fisherville Area Neighborhood Association.
That's Robinson, Colorado.
Tim Robinson, here.
Jim Bohan, City of Hillview, County Board.
Mayor Jim Heath, City of Hillview.
State Representative Linda Belcher from Bullitt County.
Kathy Hinko, Metropolitan Housing Coalition.
Randy Salmon, Kipton.
Jerry Miller, 36th District, Eastern Jefferson County.
Jared Haley, Kipton.
Andy Rush, Kipton.
Nick Vale, Kipton.
Elizabeth Fark with Kipton.
Sarah Bear Kipton.
Amanda Dethridge with Kipton.
Ashley Tinius, Kipton.
Thank you. If you all notice, I may be a little out of sorts right now. We had an incident that you all seen on TV and national TV. So if I have to step out, it's because of situations going on at this time. So if you all would say a prayer for those that have passed, that would be appropriate. But at this time, we'll have comments from any of those people in the audience that would like to. Please limit it to 3 minutes. Kathy?
Yeah. Kathy Hinko, Metropolitan Housing Coalition. We facilitate research-based advocacy on fair housing and affordable housing. And I'm sure you've all been informed that we filed a civil rights Title VI complaint against the way that this body is constituted, as completely depriving African Americans of a meaningful voice compared to the white population, which gets not just represented, but overly represented at this body. We also talked about where and when you have your meetings. You have your meetings on transportation dollars, where no one using public transit can ever get here unless they are willing to spend 12 hours getting here and going. I realize that's convenient for you, but this is about the public. You say you hold it geographically centered, but you should hold it where the most people are. And when the Federal Highway Administration came, they held their hearing at night on a bus route, and maybe you could learn something from them. So as long as you insist on keeping this as white and untransparent as you do, we will continue to advocate on behalf of our underrepresented citizens.
Thank you, Kathy. Anybody else would like to speak? Yes.
I'm Bert Stocker. I made public comments the last 2 sessions. I'm the Vice Chair of Fisherville Area Neighborhood Association. And on Amendment 10 of Horizon 2035, I believe that the change on project KIPTA 956, but changing it from 2 to 4 lanes on Highway 155 from the Gene Snyder to Highway Kentucky 148 should not be changed to widen 155 to 3 lanes. There's an increase, potential increase of over 5,000 units in the South Point Park area, and the roads are woefully in need of improvement. And just recently, there was a filing for a subdivision on Echo Trail, and that's going to dramatically impact the traffic in that area. And there's project number, Captain number 390, new interchange connector road from Kentucky 148 to US 60, with an interchange of I-64. It's a change the open public date from 2021 to 2029. That will be way too late to accommodate these new developments. And I implore that the powers to be improve both those timings and descriptions. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else would like to speak at this time? Hearing none. Amanda, you're up next with the performance management update.
Yes, thank you. All right, we're on agenda item number 5. Oh, I'm sorry, do we need to go?
Ask it, Ashley, but I've been doing that today anyway. So
That's
you're
okay,
first.
let's go back to Ashley first.
All right,
Is that
Ashley. Public meeting.
Sorry about that. On October 12th, we were at Creative Mornings at the Speed Art Museum. On October 19th, we attended the Sustainability Summit at University of Louisville. On October 20th, we were at Clark Fest in Clarksville, Indiana. October 22nd, we attended the Old Louisville Neighborhood Council meeting with Metro. And on October 24th, yesterday, we were at the Sustainability Fair at the University of Louisville talking to students about sustainability in their commuting.
Thank you. Amanda.
All right, now we're moving on to agenda item number 5, if you're following along in our packet. Updates to the performance management plan, specifically the FHWA required PM2 asset management and PM3 system performance. Also not included in the TPC mailing, but was included when you walked in today, was an addendum to agenda item number 5, calling it 5B. It's updates to the performance management plan, TAM, transit asset management targets. We will be discussing those today as well. So first, a brief overview of performance management at KIPTA. We've had a performance management plan since 2015, and we just conducted a major update that was approved by TPC 5 months ago in May of 2018. That consists of federally required performance measures. The FHWA required PM1 safety. Those targets were approved in February. Today we're talking about PM2 asset management, PM3 system performance, and those FTA required transit asset management targets. We're going to be discussing all of those today. We're also going to discuss some of our NPO developed performance measures, those that are not required by a federal agency, but that us as an NPO and you as the Transportation Policy Committee have adopted. We did not have a certain baselines for a few of those back when we approved this major update back in May, but we have baselines and targets for those now. So we're going to discuss a few roadway maintenance, non-motorized, and economic impact performance measures. So first, going on to the addendum today, the transit asset management, the TAM targets. FTA requires that TARC, or transit agencies, must set performance targets on all of their vehicle conditions and their facility conditions, and TARC being the only transit agency in our region that receives these federal funds, they're the only ones that set the targets. And so those targets are in this table right here. I'm not going to really go through them because they're really TARC's targets. We are adopting these targets today not to modify them or do anything to change them, but to support programming and planning projects that help TARC meet their targets. The reason why it had to be an addendum today is because TARC board did not approve their TAM targets until 2 days ago, October 23rd. So we're just kind of rushing them through right now to add them to our performance management plan and to adopt those targets. Later on in agenda item number 7, Nick will also be talking about these same targets when we're saying we're adding these targets to our MTP and our TIP. All of those are FTA requirements that after October 1st, 2018, we can't amend our MTP and our TIP without having these targets in our documents. So we need, later on in this presentation, you'll be approving these targets, and then later on, when Nick's presenting, you'll be approving these targets being added to our plans. Hopefully that's clear. Are there any questions about that? It's a little complicated. All right. Moving on to PM2 bridge condition. So one of the FHWA required performance measures under PM2 asset management is a bridge condition where we look at the percent of deck area of NHS carrying bridges, that's the national highway system, percent of deck area of NHS bridges that are in good condition, and also those that are in poor condition. So this table here shows what the Kentucky baselines and targets are statewide, what the Indiana baselines and targets are statewide, and then what we've proposed our MPO area baselines and targets are. And that is our 5 MPO counties. So there's one unified target for both Bullitt, Jefferson, and Oldham in Kentucky and Clark and Floyd in Indiana. So one MPO-wide target for all 5 of our counties, which makes it a little difficult comparing our by-state agency to Kentucky as a whole or to Indiana as a whole. And so what we're looking at right here is, again, the percent of deck area of bridges on the NHS that are in good condition. So Kentucky's baseline was good, 36.1%. Their target is to lower it a little bit to 35%. Of course, they want to do better than that, but they're giving themselves a little cushion. Indiana wants to maintain their target. 48.3% of the deck area was in good condition. In 4 years, they want to maintain that. And so we want to do the same. We want to maintain our good percentage. And when you look at the percent poor, Kentucky has allowed themselves a little bit of a cushion to go up in 4 years. Indiana wants to maintain their baseline. Now we kind of want to do a little bit different. Our baseline of poor bridges that carry the NHS, the deck area, is 10.5%. That's because we have several large bridges in our area that are considered poor. But we looked at our TIP, projects that are programmed in our TIP, and there are some projects that might have an impact on reducing this percent of bridges that are in poor condition. So we think we can meet a 7.1% target. So that's why we're declining our target. Now, related to this is an MPO-developed bridge performance measure. Again, this is not federally required. This is something that TPC, that our MPO, decided to go above and beyond and set a performance measure on the percent of all bridges that are in good or in poor condition, regardless of if they carry the NHS and regardless of their deck area. We want all of our bridges to be in good condition, not just the big ones that carry the NHS. And so we've set a baseline for this as well. 27.8% are good. We want to raise that to 41.7%. And 6.9% were poor in 2017. And we want to lower that to 3.5%. Now, noticeable difference here is that because this is an MPO-developed performance measure, there's no prescribed method for setting targets. These are our rules, TPC's rules. So we have a 2040 target here instead of 2022, which is why we can be a little bit more aggressive with these targets, because we're talking longer term about these. 2040 is the year that our NTP, our horizon year, that we're going to be adopting next year. And so that's why we've chosen that year. The federally required performance measures, the target year has to be 2022. Moving on back to the federally required PM2 bridge condition. I'm sorry, I didn't change it's pavement condition. We have interstate pavements, the percent that are in good condition and poor condition, and the non-interstate NHS percent pavements that are in good and poor condition. Now, just like the bridges and pavements are both on our KIPTA Online Resource Center. If you want to see a graphical, a map version of this, you can go to our Online Resource Center. You can zoom in on your bridge or your pavement that you're interested in to see if it's in good, fair, or poor condition. And so this is kind of the same thing that we were talking about earlier, where Kentucky has a baseline and a target statewide. Indiana has a baseline and a target statewide. And so we have our own 5-county target. Kentucky set themselves a declining target on both the good and the poor. They gave themselves a little bit of a cushion. And Indiana decided to maintain. And so we decided, much like the bridge ones, that we can do better. We can improve on both our good, increase our good from 46.2% to 50%, and reduce our poor from 1.9% of pavements in poor condition to just 1% of pavements in poor condition. It's the same thing with the non-interstate NHS, exactly the same concept of Kentucky set themselves a little bit of a cushion. Indiana decided to maintain their baseline, and we think we can do better on both. And so these targets were derived from an analysis that we did based on Our baselines, our current conditions, and the projects that we think are going to be completed within the next 4 years, and also accounting for current pavements that are deteriorating into poorer conditions. So kind of all these complicated calculations to come up with what we felt like was a reasonable target. Are there any questions about any of the bridge or pavement conditions? Yes.
I guess I'm a little confused why Kentucky statewide, why we would want to be building in this, why we're not trying to increase our percentage of good conditions and good roadway, where clearly Indiana right next door, one has a higher baseline than we do and wants to maintain that, and we have a fairly low baseline comparatively, and we want to lower that.
Absolutely. Before I give KYTC the opportunity to respond if they would like, there is one caveat that I haven't mentioned today, is that when it comes to the federal performance measures, the federally required ones, the state DOTs have actual punishments, consequences if they don't meet their targets. The punishments could be a redirection of funding towards their failing targets. The MPOs, we don't have any punishments, any consequences. We can set our targets at whatever we want, and there's no punishment or reward for meeting or failing to meet our targets. So we have a little bit more leeway to kind of be aggressive and really try to attain those lofty goals, while I think the state DOTs kind of have to rein that back a little bit. And from what I understand, my collaboration with KYTC and NDOT is KYTC really thinks that they are likely to maintain their baseline as well, but because of the risk of a consequence, they gave themselves a cushion just in case. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, I mean, I guess since we're lower than Indiana by quite a bit, I was wondering why we wouldn't be trying to have it, and maybe it's a funding thing, why we would not be having the ambition of trying to increase that,
Sure.
as opposed to building in the cushion.
Right. I definitely think, speaking for KYTC, I think it is a goal of theirs to increase it also, but this is the very first time that state DOTs and NPOs have ever set performance targets. And so I think the first time around, everybody's being very cautious before they really set their own goals. Would you like to elaborate?
I think that's probably true what you said, and I can't really speak to the rationale for why those targets were selected, because that was done by our Division of Maintenance, who are really the experts on pavement condition. And I'm sure that they took into consideration, in addition to the current situation, what kind of funding would be available for those projects that would address pavement condition. And again, like you say, it was probably beneficial to be a little bit on the conservative side and not get too ambitious with the targets, just so that those federal penalties would not be triggered. So I think that's a pretty good synopsis.
That was a great question. Thank you. Are there any other questions about any of the federally required bridge or pavement performance measures? All right. Moving on to, again, like the bridge, we had a federal performance measure, and we also had an MPO developed related one. We have an MPO developed pavement performance measure as well. This is not federally required, but we decided to look at what we called borderline pavements. And so these are pavement conditions that are technically fair by the federal definition, but they're at risk of falling into poor because of the way that they're calculated. They are just one poor criteria away from falling into poor overall. And so we want to try to encourage our project sponsors to rehabilitate their pavements before they ever even fall into poor condition. And so we created these borderline on interstates and borderline on non-interstate NHS performance measures, and so this is what we think we can do. On interstates, our baseline is 13% borderline. We think we can reduce that to just 10%. I'm sorry, this is borderline and worse. So this is not just borderline on its own. This is borderline and poor combined, because we didn't want to meet our target by letting our borderlines fall into poor. It's kind of one of those weird caveats where we definitely want to decrease our borderline and our poor. So 13% of all of our pavements on our interstates are in borderline or poor condition. We think we can reduce that to 10% by 2022. And on non-interstate NHS, it's a little higher at 16.0%. We think we can reduce that to 13.5%. We think those are reasonably attainable targets. Are there any questions? All right, moving on to PM3, system performance. This is another federally required, FHWA required performance measure. This looks at the performance of the NHS, the National Highway System, the interstate level of travel time reliability, and the non-interstate level of travel time reliability. So it's essentially a congestion measure. How congested is your interstate? How reliable is your interstate? If you leave to get somewhere, how likely are you going to get there on time? We also have to look at freight movement on the interstates, truck travel time reliability index, which is kind of the same thing except it's only concerned with freight movement. Now, PM3 also consists of our CMAQ traffic congestion, peak hour excessive delay, PHED, our non-single occupancy vehicle performance measure, and our total emissions reduction. And actually, those last three, we didn't have to do this time because our MPO was just barely too small. Our urbanized area was just barely under 1 million people, and only MPOs that had over 1 million had to do this. But next time, in 4 years, we will have to set performance measures on those last three, so we are keeping our eye on those on guidance so that 4 years from now, we will be prepared. That being said, these other three that we have to set targets for, our deadline to set targets is November 16th. And as it turns out, we didn't have the software capabilities to download and analyze the data by the deadline because the level of travel time reliability and the truck travel time reliability, in order to calculate that, even with our tiny 5-county region in comparison to statewide targets, it maxes out Excel's capabilities, which is astronomical. There's millions of rows that you can have, and it just maxed out the capabilities. So we didn't have the manpower to do it, to set our own targets. And that's okay, because the other option to setting targets is committing to supporting the statewide targets. So what we will report to FHWA on PM3 is this statement right here. KIPTA supports the statewide targets set forth by KYTC and NDOT by planning and programming projects that contribute to the accomplishment of each state's target. And that is allowed. So before we just blindly follow their targets, I thought I would show them to you briefly. That it's kind of a similar thing to similar methodology to the bridge and pavement ones as well, where KYTC kind of set themselves, they want to do better. They want to do better on the reliability on their interstates and set themselves a little bit of a cushion on their non-interstate NHS. And NDOT has given themselves a cushion as well. So more people are on the roads, there's more congestion, and so the interstates are getting slightly less reliable, and so they've set themselves kind of a declining target. So we're supporting planning projects that help them meet their targets. And same with the truck travel time reliability. This one's calculated a little bit differently. It's not really percentages, it's an index. And so KYTC has set themselves a little bit of a cushion, but kind of close to their baseline on how reliable it is for freight to get to where it's needing to go. And NDOT wants to kind of maintain their baseline, but also set themselves a small cushion as well to become slightly less reliable by 2022. Now, these are a little bit more complicated, and I really brushed over those. Are there any questions about that?
With the truck travel time reliability, it's not actually a percentage of the mileage, is it, for that one? I think, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, it's an index, so it's a little misleading there. It's not really percent of interstate system mileage with the reliable truck travel time. It's just an index of the interstate system mileage. Little nuance there. Yes, you had a question?
I'm from Boa County, and 65 runs through almost the middle of our county. So are these the types of studies that you were using to determine whether to widen 65, or is that what this is? Because I'm not sure.
This is something different. These are federally required performance targets to just, instead of saying we're widening I-65, this now has the data behind it to show why. Now, I know there's more project level, KYTC and NDOT can probably speak more to what it takes to conduct an analysis on whether or not they're going to widen interstate. But this is more of a very high level.
But it's the data that can support it.
Yes, and I think that's where it's going someday. The federal government wants us to start looking at this hard data to help us make planning decisions instead of just kind of doing whatever feels right. Now we know the hard data behind it. We're widening this interstate because it has low reliability. They're not really requiring that now, but I think we're heading in that direction.
Great, thank you.
KIPTA has undertaken that process already with trying to incorporate some of this data in our planning processes,
Yes.
which will be touched on here in just a few moments.
Good, I'll be interested in hearing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so switching gears back to our MPO developed performance measures. These have nothing to do with bridge or pavement or reliability. This one's non-motorized. So this was a performance measure that we've had it for years, but we didn't have baseline data on it, so we couldn't set a target on it back in May of earlier this year. Now we do have data on it. So let me explain what's going on here. We want to reduce the gaps in the existing pedestrian and dedicated bicycle networks. And so we calculated the number of miles of both of those networks, and then we calculated a gap. And so a gap is defined as having facilities on a roadway, and if there's, on the same roadway, if there's a mile gap between them, then we've identified that as a gap. If it's longer than a gap between the two sidewalk facilities, then the land use there probably doesn't necessitate needing sidewalks. And so we need to look, we still need to look closer down project level by project level to make sure that adding sidewalks or not adding sidewalks makes sense per project, but broad brush, we want to reduce the number of gaps in our bike and ped system. And so we've done a GIS exercise where we've calculated the number of miles of gaps, and based on a target that we had already set a while ago, now we can fill out it's reduced by 20%. By 2040. And so it's kind of the same thing for the next performance measure, an economic impact performance measure, where we want to enhance pedestrian facilities within areas of moderate to significant employment growth. We also want to enhance dedicated bicycle facilities within those same areas. So we couldn't calculate that last time because we were in the middle of conducting a socioeconomic analysis to determine what those areas are. What areas are moderate or significant or slight employment growth? And so now that we've completed that and TPC has approved that, we can tell you that there's 268.4 miles of pedestrian facilities inside TADs with moderate significant employment growth, and we want to increase that to 295. Same with the bicycle. It was 45, we want to increase it to 49. So those targets were set before. The percentages were set before, we just didn't have the baseline, so we couldn't fill out those figures. All right, so the next steps today, KIPTA will incorporate our TAM targets into our MTP and our TIP. Nick will talk more about that later. By November 16th of this year, KIPTA must report our PM2 and PM3 targets to state DOTs. Those are the bridge and pavement performance measures, and the system congestion ones. By May 29th of next year, updates or amendments to our MTP and TIP must include PM2 and PM3, so we have a few more months before we have to add those. Sometime in early 2019, we're going to submit our baseline performance period report, which we're hoping will be a mostly visual, very easily understood report on all of our performance measures, showing you where we stood in 2018 on all of our performance targets. And then in 2 years and 4 years, we'll be submitting a mid-performance period report and a full performance period report, showing you visually how we're doing. Are we meeting our targets? Are we making progress towards meeting our targets? In February of 2019, KIPTA has to report our 2015 to 2019 5-year rolling average PM1 safety targets to state DOTs. So we did that back in February last year. We'll be doing it every February from here on out. And so now the only thing left to do is to start tracking progress towards achieving our targets. I do have 2 actions requested today. One is approval of the FTA required TAM targets and the FHWA required PM2 and PM3 targets. We're having that action separately since they are federally required. And then a second motion giving us permission to update the performance management plan with those changes that we've talked about today. Are there any questions?
Hearing none, I entertain a motion to approve the PM3, PM2 report.
Motion.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Systems performance, PM3. Any discussion? Motion.
So moved.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Second, Bernie. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Nick, is that all?
Thank you.
Nick, quarterly project report.
Yes, thank you. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Bale. I'm with KIPTA, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about our quarterly project review process for the last 3 months. This is something we do every quarter. For a little background for those who are new to us, the TPC approved a process back in September of 2016 that determines how we prioritize and program the dedicated funds that come directly to KIPTA and TPC for award. So in the universe of funds that are used for transportation projects, there are projects that are selected by KYTC and approved, of course, by the legislature and signed by the governor. And similarly in NDOT, there's another process that they have. We have a much smaller bucket of funds that we are able to, you collectively are able to award and to specific projects. So one of the things that we've done is implemented this process a couple years ago. Every quarter, the project sponsors are required to fill out a progress report, tell us whether each phase of their project is on schedule. And then there are also opportunities periodically for sponsors to submit phase shift applications, meaning, hey, we're not going to make it to construction in 2018 on road X. We need to push that out to 2019. And there's limits to that. And then as well, there are sometimes going to be opportunities for cost increases. So next quarter, or 2 quarters from now, we'll have an opportunity for folks to apply for funds if they have any cost increases for phases of their projects. There are rules in terms of how we manage the costs and schedules. For costs, requests for increases can go up to 20%. Anything above that, there has to be a special exception made by the TPC. That is just to hopefully keep those requests reasonable, but obviously there are sometimes mitigating circumstances that require a cost increase over 20%. In terms of managing schedules, we allow each phase of each project to be able to be shifted back 2 fiscal years before an exception has to be made to TPC. And we haven't come to that point yet because we've only been doing this for a couple years, but next year that could be a reality for some projects. And then finally, kind of a nuance to the programs that we have funds for. So in Indiana we have 4, and in KIPTA we have 2, and I'll show those just in a minute. We have the ability, if we want to, if TPC would like to shift up to 50% of each one of those programs' allocations to the more general surface transportation block grant program. So that's just kind of a nuance that we're able to do, and it happens more often in Indiana, actually. So today, just a brief status of how things are looking for our Indiana dedicated projects. Just to orient you to this table across the top are the 4 dedicated funding programs: Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, Highway Safety Improvement Program, Surface Transportation Block Grant, and Transportation Alternatives Program, which is essentially mostly focused on bike, pedestrian, and transit improvements. And so for Indiana, I've listed the annual allocation of funds across the top row. Next, you see the obligations that have occurred so far. We've had some in CMAQ and under the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. And then the final line are the unobligated funds that still need to be basically authorized by federal highways once those projects are ready to move forward. So we've still got some work to do, but obviously we're early in fiscal year 19. And at this time, this quarter, there were no phase shifts or cost increases. So there's no action on any of the Indiana projects this quarter. In terms of Kentucky status, it's a little more complicated because, well, for one, we only have the 2 programs that we receive funds for directly. And we are able to carry over funds from year to year. And so what's happened over time is that we've built up a balance of funds. And you can see for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, about $43 million was programmed at the beginning of this fiscal year, or at the beginning of last fiscal year 18. During the year, we obligated about $14 million in projects and shifted almost $30 million to future phases. So that in the big picture is something we definitely want to work on, and all of our sponsors are doing everything they can to make that happen. Under the Transportation Alternatives Program, we had far fewer dollars to work with, about 4.1. We obligated about a third of that, and we've got $2.7 to $3 million that shifted to fiscal year 19, and hopefully all of those, I think, are on track, it seems like, based on the progress reports we received during the quarter. For proposed changes, in Kentucky, because it was the end of the fiscal year, many projects unfortunately didn't make it to authorization. And for folks that don't know, some federal highways authorizes funds, and then those funds can be obligated. So sometimes those are synonymous with each other. We had 21 phase shifts that were requested. They are all provided in your packet. I didn't include them all up here. If anyone would like to talk about a specific one, we can. But none of these phases have been shifted more than twice, so there's no special exceptions needed. So essentially, my action for today in this presentation is for you all, TPC, to approve the 21 phase shifts.
Entertain a motion to approve the shifts.
So moved.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Nick, you got the amendments.
I do. Thank you. All right. So my next presentation is in regards to Amendment 10 of the Horizon 2035 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That's our 20-year long-range plan, as well as Amendment 3 of our fiscal year 18 to 2021 TIP. So the MTP is where we plan our projects, and then once a project receives funding, that project moves into our TIP, if that funding is within those fiscal years. So a little bit of background here. These amendments are primarily comprised of non-exempt projects. That means they are capacity widening or capacity adding projects in most cases. You'll see a lot of those on our interstate, I-71 and 265, of course. The vast majority of these projects originate from the recently approved 6-year highway plan in Kentucky. It was passed back in, I think, the spring of this year. Additionally, to the project changes that were included in this amendment, as well as we have to amend these documents to include all of the performance targets that Amanda has been meeting with us about, and you guys haven't been approving like you did in just this presentation two items ago. The ones that we're amending today as part of these amendments are the TARC Transit Asset Management targets that were approved by their TARC board on Tuesday, and the ones that you all just incorporated or approved at the MPO level, I should say. In terms of comments received, we did receive many comments this go around. We've included all of them in your packet today. You should have basically 4 large attachments. 1 that includes all the changes to projects. 2 related to all the transit performance measures. 3 air quality conformity documentation. Because we're widening highways and things of that nature, we have to do an air quality conformity, which basically shows that we're not going to exceed the allowable limit on ozone. And then the last 3 or 4 pages of your packet should have public comments that we received over the last 45 days or so. Those were all sent to you guys in advance, TPC members, a couple weeks ago. And all of those comments have also been forwarded on to all of the implementing agencies who are sponsoring the specific projects. So a little more about the actual projects that are being changed to the MTP first. So there's a lot in there, and so I wanted to just select a few projects that are brand new that didn't exist in our long-range plan before. So things like widening of I-65 from 6 to 8 lanes, as Representative Belcher mentioned earlier. The new I-71 interchange between KY 393 and 53. There's another interchange at 71 and 323, as well as a couple other improvements to highways, most notably 65 and 265. So these are brand new projects that are being added to our plan. They don't necessarily have dollars that will be added to the TIP at this time. It kind of depends on the project. But the projects that do have funds that have now been moved into our TIP, meaning they're getting close to ready to obligate some of these funds and begin or move forward on some of these projects. So you've got improvements on the I-64 corridor. Obviously, that won't involve expansion of the Cochran Hill Tunnel. We've got addition of north and southbound auxiliary lanes on 71 from Kennedy to Zorn. And then I think there's multiple big ones in here, but the widening of I-71 from 4 to 6 lanes. There's 2 or 3 segments that obviously have been included in this amendment. Any questions about any of the projects that are included in this amendment? Yes, ma'am.
May go back to your first presentation. Once these funds are obligated, do they just stay encumbered until the project is finished, or is there a deadline set and the project has to be completed? What I'm wondering is, money just sitting there waiting for something that maybe is not happening?
Good question. Just a quick clarification. The projects that I presented earlier in my last presentation, those are all projects that the TPC here agreed to approve funding for. Mm-hmm. Most of the projects that I'm presenting now are ones that the 6-year that the legislator approved as part of the 6-year highway plan. Are there deadlines and cutoffs in terms of encumbering those funds? I would say there are, but there's a lot of flexibility that federal highways and federal transit allows for.
Okay, I was talking primarily about your first group.
The last slide, or sorry, the last presentation.
The last presentation.
So one of the rules we have, for the last presentation, for our dedicated funds, if that project has shifted or been delayed 2 fiscal years, then that project sponsor has to come to this board or this committee and present compelling reasons why that project should continue to be placed in our TIP and hold funds for other projects that may be able to move forward quicker.
That's
so,
what I wanted to know. Thank you.
You bet. Yes.
About the air quality, it was predicted there'd be no appreciable increase on the Shono-Mitten Bridge, but in fact, there's 23 to 30% more vehicles on that bridge every day, and they cluster at different times. Is the air quality going to study whether we're poisoning African-American neighborhoods because we didn't predict correctly how much more transit there will, how many more vehicles there will be? Or are we just going to say, oh, we missed the mark and now we don't care? Is that part of what's going to be planned to be done?
I would ask that Randy Simon, he's here with our air quality staff, and he would probably be able to better answer that question than I would from an air quality perspective.
The analysis that's presented here is a regional analysis. It was done on the 5 counties as a whole. My understanding is that the Air Pollution Control District of Jefferson County is doing some work, and they're going to break this down into smaller geographic areas.
Representative Mill.
If you go back to the slide you had up there about Plant Side Drive extension.
Yes.
You said from Real Road, but there's a gap between the end of Plant Side and Real Road. So is this was that other one already on? And this is a change? I didn't quite understand. It's the next to last one.
You mind helping me out with that question on Plant Side Drive?
If I'm not mistaken on that one, maybe somebody else can speak to it. If I'm not mistaken, it's a Plant Side is an east-west road, of course, just at the department where we are. This road would be go east-west and then it would curve to the south and connect to the road.
The question is
just east of the interchange.
Plant Side doesn't connect to Real yet.
Right. I think it's included.
Is that already on the plan, and this is the addition to take it from Real to Taylorsville?
Could somebody from KYTC speak on the intention there?
When we were developing, working with the developer on estimates for that, they demanded that we not include that section, Hollenbach Oakley. I think you really need to ask Hollenbach Oakley that.
Oh, okay. So their money is extending it to Real?
That project is scoped between Real and Taylorsville Road.
Yeah, that project, so.
We
that Hollenbach
don't, we
Oakley
honestly
is paying-
we don't know how that gap's gonna be addressed, but they said do not include it in your all's part.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Sure, no problem. Yes.
Maybe can you kind of address the two concerns that were brought up from Fisher Well Area Neighborhood Association? Those two concerns. One is change of scope. 956, I guess, that the project number from reduce the lane, proposed lane from 4 to 3, and also I think the timeline kind of understand because it hasn't got started, so it's not likely to open 2020. But can you explain a little bit about the change of the scope from 4 lane to 3 lane?
I'm going to probably turn that over to KYCC, but essentially, that project, I think, is still in the design phase.
Well,
is that correct? I believe that one's still in the design phase, and so the ultimate, I think,
The widening of Taylorsville Road between Snyder and 148 has not even begun.
Right.
It's just, yeah, so, I know that,
Well, when the highway plan came out, the highway plan really very specifically stated it would be a 3-lane widening. So for us to use federal money, we have to reflect the name of the project that was presented in the highway plan. We have to program that exact name into the TIP so that we can get the federal funding. I guess the question is, are we going to build exactly a 3-lane widening there? I mean, I think we have to go through the analysis and see if that would work. I don't know that
There's
would
no
work.
federal money in that, in the widening of 155 though. That was all STP money.
That's federal.
That's federal. Sometimes just a nuance to your, I think, point there. If you see STP state versus STP urban, the STP urban funds come directly to our area for selection and award by you all here. Anytime you see STP state, those are federal funds that the state of Kentucky.
In the road plan, we just say STP, not STP. We have STP and then we have federal.
Right, and I think that's primarily because the legislature doesn't necessarily approve the urban funds that come here. So I think in terms of the plan, that would be accurate as saying they're STP funds regardless, but they're separate. We get our own little slice of the larger STP pie. Sure. Any other questions or comments?
Ellen, are you okay?
Yes, does that answer the question? I mean, I think that's the name of the project still need to be defined further, my understanding. So we don't know exactly the 3-lane or 4 lanes at this time, right?
So it could potentially, it looks like right now all that's programmed in the TIP is preliminary engineering or design. So, so that, I mean, I think the gentleman raised some valid points. So that's something that the district could potentially look at as part of the preliminary engineering. I mean, make sure that the 3-lane would be adequate.
Right.
Sure, that's part of engineering. Yeah.
Is the project that's handling the intersection where Hatmakers is that a separate project?
Yes.
Is that already underway?
Yes.
How many lanes is that proposed to be at the intersection?
As many as necessary.
You're widening
They
the
have
bridge.
designated 3 or 4.
What's that?
They have not designated through lanes.
No, we haven't. We're in, that is a point of discussion at this point because there's a difference of about $1 million to about $5 million in doing what is needed for just the intersection and what is accommodating for future widening, which we don't even know yet. So we're at that crossroads right now with our design to figure that out. But I do know that we are certainly considering what is needed for the widening. As Tom said, I personally don't think 3 lanes is going to get it, but we're matching what the highway plan says at this point. For as far as open to traffic dates, we have to come up with something and shoot for it, but those are not binding dates and those are not binding descriptions. We have to go through the process to figure what those things are.
So the big thing at the intersection is a bridge. That's your bigger point.
Yes, because we could, initially the low cost option is to pull the top off of the bridge, leave the substructure, do a little bit of widening, provide for a turn lane, get out of there. So accommodating future widening is what we're looking at.
Thank you, man.
Okay. Move on just to a little bit regarding the TAM targets, Transit Asset Management targets that the TARC board approved 2 days ago. They were briefly included in Amanda's presentation. These are the targets that will be amended, hopefully, with your action here in a bit, into both our TIP and our MTP. So they break down rolling stock, buses, cutaway vans, or cutaway buses and vans, the equipment, heavy-duty equipment, power stations, and that sort of thing, and then, of course, their facilities as well. These are categories that are mandated by Federal Transit Administration and were approved by TARC board 2 days ago. And then lastly, just an updated amendment schedule here. We started this process back in June. We did a staff review of all the projects. We had an interagency consultation group. That is something where because these projects are intended to add capacity or termed non-exempt, we have to meet with Federal Highways, Federal Transit, EPA, and other groups internally and regionally here to ensure that we stay within the federally allowed ozone budget. We had a public comment period from the 14th to the 29th. We had an open house down at the library on York, downtown, on the 19th. TPC comment period for 15 days. TTC did recommend your approval of these amendments, and so I'm here today for your action, which is twofold. The first action that I'd like you all to consider is to approve Amendment 10 to the Horizon 2035 MTP, including both project changes and transit-related performance-based planning and programming documentation. I know it's a mouthful.
Entertain a motion to approve. Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. We'll fight over this guy. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you all. And the second action is to approve Amendment 3 to the fiscal year 2018-2021 TIP, inclusive of the project changes and the transit-related performance-based planning and programming documentation.
Again, we'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you all.
Thank you. David?
Okay, I'm not going to take up a lot of your time. I just want to get you up to speed where we are with our update to the MTP. As you know, we've been continuing to work on the MTP update, and we're getting to that crucial point where we start to identify the projects that we want to have considered in this update. Over the last couple of years, the staff has brought to you on numerous occasions tools that we wanted to help inform that process. So we're going to kind of show you where we are with those right now. We've started the project development workshop. These are training sessions that staff is leading to help you help project sponsors to become more familiar with the tools that have been created as we go forward. So as you asked a few moments ago, so that we can bring in the data that you had just asked about, bring that data into the process so that so that the project sponsors are more informed as they define projects, and this committee is more informed as they approve projects. So we're trying to make that a complete process. We had our first workshop on the 16th of this month. Our next one is tomorrow, and then we have one more on the 1st of the month. So as we've said, we've been bringing to you pieces of information, and you've seen these things, some of them multiple times, and they just layer on top of each other. It's data that we've collected, analysis that we've done. It's information that we thought was very important to help to inform us what are the important projects, what are the important issues that we need to make sure that we include in our MTP update. So that's what we've been doing over these years. When Andy has talked to you numerous times about the crash analysis, this is why. When we've talked to you about clustering of data, and we talked to you about targets for your performance measures and the measures that have been identified by Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administrations, we're doing that for now, for this purpose, for when we start project development. So we have brought you layers and layers of data But what we're doing with these workshops is we're beginning to make sure that that data tells a story so that you can understand how to best utilize that data as we go forward with trying to identify what you want to see in the MTP in terms of how transportation will evolve going forward. So that's our goal has been to bring you information, and now we're trying to organize that information in a way that helps to inform project sponsors, helps to inform the Transportation Policy Committee, and helps to inform the public as to what are reasonable expectations, what are reasonable issues, and do we all understand that we're dealing from the same hymnal, or we're singing from the same hymnal, we're comparing apples to apples. And we're all working together and working towards a single unified vision of trying to improve our transportation system as you have asked us to do, using the goals and objectives that you have given us. So this is why we've been collecting all this information and bringing it to you, and now we're going to bring it back to you in a manner that will allow us to identify projects. So we've been working. It's very important. I'm going to hit on this a couple of times. These workshops are the means for us to help to educate the project sponsors on how to utilize these tools that we've made available. We have a transportation planning portal that has become that that single location for you as the Transportation Policy Committee, for your staffs, for the public to go to in order to identify what are the concerns that we want to make sure we address. If we have poor pavement that we need to address, let's make sure we know about it. Because if we know about it, we can fix it. If we don't know about it, we can't fix it. So that's what we're trying to do with this information. And the reason that these workshops are so important is because we are looking to make sure that the projects address the issues that you've identified. And we want to make sure you know how to tell us which project to do that. Because if you don't tell us what your projects are going to do, we can't tell you how well they're going to address the issues. So it's dependent upon the project sponsors to understand that if they're going to include sidewalks in a particular project, they need to inform us, because if you don't tell us, we won't know about it. And if we don't know about it, when we do our project rankings and we bring these projects back to you that say high, medium, and low, we want to make sure that we accounted for those sidewalks, or that we accounted for that roadway improvement you're making is actually going to also address a pavement issue. So there's all kinds of layers of information that we want to make available to you, and we strongly encourage you to participate in this process. So we're talking about the workshops. Then what happens? So we've basically identified 5 steps that we want to use going forward. The first one is in early November, you have seen in the past from us what we call project information forms. Those are it's the information about the projects that are in the current MTP Horizon 2035. We're going to make those available to you because we want you to look at them. Do you still want to proceed with that particular project? And if you do want to proceed, is the information that you gave us when we did the last update correct? And we're going to ask you for more information that maybe you didn't provide or weren't sure about when you gave us that project information 4 years ago or 8 years ago. In some cases, we have projects that are still in our MTP from when I first started working here 27 years ago, in 1993, that says this project, we want to do this project. Well, obviously, someone doesn't want to do that project, so let's take it out. So those are the types of things we want to try to address. Randy's back there laughing because he was sitting there next to me 27 years ago when we were doing this. Okay, the second step is we're going to start asking you to give us projects using this portal that we have identified, or we have created. It has lots of information. We're going to ask you to say, okay, here are the projects that we want to continue to include that are in your current Horizon 2035 MTP, and here are the new projects we want to introduce to your MTP. And you're going to give us all this information through this portal. And the way to find out about the portal is to come to these workshops. There's one tomorrow, one on the 1st of the month, and we will spend all day and provide lunches for you to sit and we will work with you to go through this process. The third step is when KIPTA staff is going to sit down after you've given us all the information you know about a project. KIPTA staff is going to sit down and say, okay, we have goals and objectives that you, the policy committee, have provided us. We have Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration performance measures we have to address. So these are the things that we're going to look at as a staff and say, okay, based on the information that the project sponsors have provided, each project does this or that relative to the issues that you've identified. Are you adding sidewalks where there's a gap? If so, check. If you are improving access to transit, check. If you are improving freight movement on the freight network, check. So you've got to be sure to try to give us all the information that you have available. Okay, so we have this ranking process that we've talked to you about many times before. But we also acknowledge that that ranking process may not address everything. And so we're going to give you the opportunity to look at the projects that have been ranked by staff and help us to identify those things that staff has missed. Because I'm sure that's going to happen. So we're going to ask to sit down with you guys and say, hey, I am going to improve movement on the freight network, and here's how. And so we'll say, oh, okay, so then we'll change that score for that particular issue. So we want to continue to work with you. This isn't just a staff-based thing. This is a group effort that's going to require the project sponsors and get the staff to sit down together and work through some of these things. So we want to have that consultation process. And finally, we're going to come back to this committee, the Transportation Policy Committee, and say, okay, here are all the projects that have been submitted by our sponsors. Here's how they ranked compared to the goals and objectives that you've identified. What do you think? And you're going to look at that information. You're going to say, well, we like it once you proceed to the next step of the MTP. Or you might say, we don't like it once you take 2 steps back and review review X, Y, and Z. And then we'll do that and we'll come back to you again. But the point is, for you the TPC to reach a point of satisfaction that we have done all we can to identify candidate projects for our process. And once you've done that, we're going to continue on with the MTP update. Now, when we talk about the MTP, we talk about this large, global almost, series of issues and projects that need to be developed. We cover for the full KIPTA MPA, we have a 20-year horizon, and we talk about planning. But a subset of that is the Transportation Improvement Program. Same KIPTA 5 counties, a 5-year horizon instead of a 20-year horizon. And this is where we talk about programming projects, the projects that you've identified in the MPP. Which ones are ready to advance? And this is where Nick and Amanda are going to step in and kind of lead that effort. Nick, you want to go from there?
So, like I mentioned a little bit before, there's kind of 3 and maybe 4 universes of how projects get selected and enter into our TIP. One is from KYTC, their 6-year highway plan, and other maybe asset management plans that they have where maintenance projects are derived from. NDOT has something similar. There's KIPTA dedicated funds, and then TARC also has, it's a little nuanced, they have their own kind of formula funds that come, and obviously they are the only public transit agency with a few partner agencies that can utilize those funds. So I wanted to just kind of let you guys know that in the spring, we're going to be having a project working group that's going to sit down and use all of the data that's been provided, or use all the information that you guys have provided through project development, and utilize that in terms of whether we're going to recommend new projects or prioritize existing projects. And so I've done a 2-stage kind of breakdown of all the programs here, looking at how much funding is currently programmed in our TIP and how much future funding is already essentially tied to those projects. And so for each one of these programs, I've broken down here. In Indiana, we have our 4 programs. Across the top, how much funding is available between fiscal year 2020 and 2025? That's going to be our new TIP, because obviously this is going to be enacted at the end of fiscal year 2019, so we'll be moving on. So it'll be a 5-year TIP. And for each one of those programs, I've listed the dollar amounts that we project to receive from the federal government. The second column, and you see numbers are highlighted in red, are the total cost of existing TIP projects, so projects that are in our 18 to 21 TIP that have unfunded future phases, because we want to make sure that we complete a project that we start. We don't want to stop at right of way and not fund the construction of a project, of course. So I've deducted those amounts that are unfunded future phases from what's available to determine that third column or fourth column there, funds that are available for new TIP projects. So in the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program in Indiana, there are no unfunded future phases in the TIP for any CMAQ projects. So we are going to have $4 million available over a number of years, of course, where we'll be able to, a project working group will be able to recommend new projects to bring to TTCC and TPC. In the Highway Safety Improvement Program, we've got $3 million that we think will be available. We've got $2 million in projects that are already going to basically account for most of those funds. So we've only got about $1 million left. So the project working group will be both recommending or prioritizing existing projects that are currently unfunded and recommending new ones. Surface Transportation Program, again, there we don't have any new funds available because we've got all of these unfunded phases that we need to finish out our old projects. And so the working group won't be recommending anything new there. They'll be prioritizing existing projects. Who gets to go first, that sort of thing. It'll be a little bit complicated, but that's kind of why we have the project working groups. And then finally, the Transportation Alternatives Program, there'll be about $1 million because Indiana only receives about $200,000 every year for our region. And so they'll recommend new projects. So it's important that any projects that are either currently in the TIP that you want to continue moving forward for and get funding for are submitted through the MTP development process, and any new projects that you have planned for the next 5 to 10 years that you want to compete for any of these programs where it says recommend new projects. So if you've got a bike and ped project in mind in Indiana, you need to make sure you submit that through our MTP development process because it's got to be in our long-range plan first so that it can then move into our TIP. Does that make sense? I know this is a little bit high level, but hopefully this is coming across clearly. In Kentucky, we just have the 2 dedicated funding programs that the TPC makes awards or selections for. In the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, through fiscal year 2020 to 2025, we think we're going to have about $69 million available. Well, we have $73 million in phases of existing projects that are currently unfunded. And so the project working group's goal is going to be to prioritize those existing projects. And they're going to do that based on information that's submitted through the MTP development and used to rank our projects. And for the other program, Transportation Alternatives, we do have about $6 million that will be available for new projects. So if you've got projects in mind for the next 5 to 20 years, make sure that they are submitted through the MTP development process so that they can be considered by the project working group for funding in the spring. So we've tried to line this all up so that it hopefully is somewhat intuitive. I know it's a bit more complicated than we would like it to be, but
what
yes, ma'am.
exactly are transportation alternative programs? Is that like bus slot?
Sure. It can be bus, transit, bike ped. It's traditionally, anything outside of a single occupancy vehicle, although there are some nuances there as well. But traditionally, shared use pass, bike lanes, TARC's been awarded funds for solar bus shelters and that sort of thing. So yes, those are the types of projects. You bet. Any other questions? This is kind of just the wrap up, that just kind of the push to, not only are you guys adding projects to the MTP, you guys are going to be submitting projects that compete for funds in the spring. And that's all I have.
Well, there's one more, is that we want to make sure that the TIP going forward is not just the dedicated funding sources, but it's all funding sources. Federal funding sources that are going to be programmed in our region have to be in the TIP. So if you want to, if you or your member agencies want to fund a project using federal funds, it has to be programmed in this transportation improvement program. If you try to go to the state or to the Federal Highway Administration and ask them that, can we go ahead and do this project, the first place they're going to do is tell you, the first thing they're going to do is say, go to KIPTA, because your federal project using federal funds has to be on a transportation improvement program. And if a project is in the transportation improvement program, it has to be in the MTP. So everything sort of starts with the MTP and gets us back to getting projects on the ground. So that's why we're really pushing that it's important for you to be involved in these project development workshops. We have one tomorrow, and then we have one on November 1st. Elizabeth Fark over here has been handling the registration. Right now we have 21 people attending tomorrow and 23 on the 1st of November. So if you have not registered to participate, please do so. You can talk to Elizabeth about how to make that happen. Yeah, it's pretty important stuff, and we're pretty excited about what we've been able to provide our sponsors. Going forward.
Thank you, David. That's all we have. Amanda, Tip.
Yes, okay. Lastly, really quickly, we're talking about agenda item number 9, administrative modification 22 of the 18 to 21 tip. There is a spreadsheet in your mailing of all of the projects that we're making changes to. These changes are relatively minor, and we do not need any action on them today. We're just presenting them to you for your information. There was also an addendum that we sent out that was with your packet when you walked in today. Most of these project changes are derived from those 21 phase shifts that Nick talked about earlier and that you guys just approved. That's what the majority of these are. Some of these are cost changes. There were a few projects where we had programmed a certain amount, but KYTC only obligated a portion of that. And so we allowed all of those project sponsors to take the portion that was unobligated and transfer that to another phase of their project. And that was kind of the addendum of what we added today, was the obligation was different than what we thought it was when we mailed it out. The only new project being added is a KYTC various bridge maintenance project. They are rehabilitating some bridges on I-65, and that is eligible to be added through an admin mod. So are there any questions about any of these projects? All right, thank you guys.
You don't need any motion at all?
No, not for this.
Any other business? Any other business to bring forward? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second, Bernie. All in favor?
I do have one small piece. Jared, when's the next TPC meeting going to take place?
It is November 20th, or Tuesday prior to Thanksgiving at 9:30 at the Louisville Marriott.
So make sure to put that into your calendar, please.
Thanks, everybody. Meeting at 2:00.
November 20th.